and thank you for making me a part of this your program tonight. Since Chuck went over the history of the Safe Drinking Water Act, I'll talk more about some current debates going on. But first, I'll pose a question to you all. Think about it for a second. Drinking water is collected locally, treated locally, and distributed locally. So how do you justify any federal law on this? Well, the answer is back in 1914, the U.S. Public Health Service decided that we needed to stop the transmission of communicable diseases in water on interstate trains and buses and eventually airplanes. In other words, we needed safe water to facilitate interstate commerce. So that was the genesis of federal regulation of drinking water. And now it is, we've progressed much further, as Chuck said. The latest big change was in 1996, as he said, when we had the latest amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act, which changed the processes for determining what to regulate and how to regulate it. And it imposed a very data-driven, science-driven process, which also means it's slow. And that slowness has frustrated a lot of people. And so I'll get into some of the current debates right now going on in drinking water. There are some of the environmentalist and activist organizations that say, as I just said, the regulatory process is too slow. And they point to a lack of new substances regulated since 1996. They contend that the cost-benefit analysis portion of the Safe Drinking Water Act is overemphasized. They say it's done in the feasibility studies, then there's a separate cost-benefit analysis, and it just makes everything too slow. Now, in EPA's defense, I have to say my office was a part of the negotiations for the what's called the Stage 2 Microbial Disinfection Byproducts Rule. It's quite a mouthful. That amounted to a whole new set of regulations. And I visited water utilities that were spending millions of dollars on new treatment facilities to comply with this new regulation. Because we discovered over time that, yes, we must, what we knew from the turn of the century, we must control microbial contamination of drinking water systems. And then over time, we discovered that as you apply these disinfectants to organic matter, you get byproducts. And some of those byproducts, coupled with long-term exposure, are potential carcinogens or have other health effects. So the MDBPR rule was very complex. It amounted to a whole new rule. Chuck referred to revisions to the lead and copper rule. That is a major change in how we're going to be dealing with this. I'll get into that a little bit more, and you're going to do that in another workshop. Perchlorate is an off and on again regulation. The Bush administration determined not to regulate. The Obama administration determined to regulate it. Trump administration last summer issued a ruling that, or a finding that perchlorate no longer occurs at levels at which, regulation could have a meaningful effect on public health protection. So perchlorate's off the table, but I think it's back in court again. So basically, it sounds like, yeah, there are challenges in developing new regulations. The primary challenge is the dearth of human health effects data to drive new regulation. Over the years, we've regulated all the obvious threats to human health. The challenge for us now is we're able to detect substances before we know what that means. So say we find 3 parts per trillion of contaminant X in the water. Well, we know it doesn't seem to have any immediate human health effects, but what are the effects over 20 years of exposure? We don't know that yet. Another new set of regulations to watch for, been in the news a lot, is part of the PFAS family of contaminants. EPA has made a determination to regulate PFOA and PFAS. And that is the final regulation is a few years away because of all the processes they have to go through that I referred to earlier. But they have determined to regulate it. The concern for the drinking water community is EPA is also likely to declare those two substances hazardous substances under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, also known as Superfund. Our concern is that even though utilities are not the source of this contamination, we're kind of in the middle of it. There have been 600 instances in the past where the responsible party in a Superfund action has sued municipalities to help pay for the cleanup cost. Now, we have gone to Congress and said airports have a liability exemption for PFAS from Superfund. Why don't we? And that's an ongoing discussion. The lead and copper rule, I'll mention a few more things about that. Yes, the Trump administration issued a regulation in December. NRDC and some other organizations have gone to court against that, saying it is inadequate, as Chuck said. AWWA has filed a request to intervene in the case. We have a vested interest in the outcome. We don't know if I have not heard whether or not that request has been granted or not. The challenge is, as Chuck was referring to, lead is not in the source water. It is leached out of lead service lines and household plumbing or brass fixtures. AWWA commissioned a study a few years ago. We determined there's more than 6 million lead service lines in the United States. And it costs anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 to remove each lead service line. It depends on where you are in the country and the local cost of things like that. Now, all that said, before we started removing the lead lines, corrosion control was the primary means of protecting people from exposure to lead. And when it's done properly, it works. But if the pipe is disrupted, or the ground shakes, that coating, or if someone is not watching the pH of the water and it gets too low, you get corrosion. It starts peeling lead out of those lines. So corrosion control can work, but it must be administered correctly. And even if we were to remove every single lead service line in this country, and we will eventually, we're still going to have to practice corrosion control because of the legacy lead solders out there, brass fixtures, and other household plumbing fixtures that may have lead in it. Big, as Chuck was referring to, aging infrastructure is a major challenge for water utilities. AWWA commissioned a report in 2012 called Buried No Longer. It's on our website. You can look at it. We found that this nation needs to invest $1 trillion in the next 25 years to maintain our current level of service. And wastewater infrastructure needs are typically equal. Now, the good news is there seems to be a greater recognition in Congress and in the public that we need to invest more in water infrastructure. There have been an increase in funding of loan programs that the federal government runs, and we expect to see those programs reauthorized this session of Congress at even higher levels of authorized spending. And I always make a note, Congress authorizes spending for a program, but no money flows until the next step when they appropriate funding. So if you're talking to a member of Congress and he or she says, we have worked to authorize funding for this program, say, okay, what about the appropriations? Tag them on that. Water infrastructure, investment in water infrastructure creates jobs too. The Department of Commerce estimates that every dollar spent on water infrastructure generates 2.62 additional dollars in the private economy of the country. Every job added in the water workforce creates 3.68 jobs in the national economy. So, we're telling Congress, when you're doing your economic recovery legislation, don't forget that water infrastructure is a dollar and job multiplier. Another big challenge for the water sector is small systems. The United States has about 50,000 community water systems serving 286 million people. Now, a community water system, there's public water systems in the in the legal language, and community water systems. I talk about community water systems. That is a water system serving the same at least 25 people year round. So it's your local water utility, basically. 9% of the community water system serves 78% of the US population. What that means is there are a whole lot of small systems out there. And the challenge for them is in the economy of scale. It's expensive to comply with regulations, to maintain your water infrastructure, and to keep good staffing. So we're encouraging partnerships. That's partnerships. You have to be careful in the language you use. It's politically dicey. Partnerships can be a spectrum of activities. Anything from, cooperatively buying your supplies in bulk to get a lower price, to sharing managerial or technical staff, mutual aid agreements in the case of emergency, all the way to consolidation and acquisition. The states of California and Kentucky are moving very aggressively to encourage small systems to form partnerships. Mergers and acquisitions are very difficult because of local politics. Sometimes they're difficult because of geography. If water systems are on the opposite side of a mountain range, it's really hard to connect them physically. So that's where you might have to share management. Also, there's a compliance issue. Say Utility A has stayed on top of its infrastructure needs by using modern asset management tools and charging rates to keep the system sustainable. Well, then the state strongly asked Utility A to take over neighboring Utility B structure slide. They're not evil, but they're a poor community, so they have not maintained their infrastructure. Well, once A merges with B and it's one utility, they may be at risk of being in violation of regulations. And it's just because they're a good Samaritan taking over this system. So they're going to have to invest in new infrastructure and bringing the treatment up to speed. I know of a utility in eastern Pennsylvania that acquired a neighboring utility, and they had to replace a whole lot of pipes. The poor utility had the wrong size pipes going through the neighborhoods. It was a major infrastructure investment. Another challenge that's been in the news lately is cybersecurity. You might be aware of a small to medium-sized utility in Florida last month that got hacked. Fortunately, an operator was on the ball and saw what was happening before dangerous levels of chemicals were released into the system. Did point out the vulnerabilities. Congress passed a law in 2018 that required utilities to do risk assessments, which included cyber risk assessments and an updating of risk management plans. That Florida utility was in the category of small utilities and its deadline for doing its risk assessment is this June. So they also, I hate to throw a utility under the bus, but they're not members. They were using Windows 7, which, as you probably know, Microsoft does not provide security updates for anymore. They also had 1Password for all the remote terminals that were logging into the system. So that was an invitation to disaster. So yeah, update your own. They were probably using less security than you were on your personal laptop. Assistance to low-income customers is a big issue right now. Congress passed a huge budget bill in December that provided $638 million to help low-income customers pay their water bills because of this pandemic and the economic recession. It's being administered through the Department of Health and Human Services. This is a brand new program in a brand new presidential administration, so it's taking them some time to get it up and running. I've talked to the director of the program over there. They are working hard. They feel the enormity of the task, but they're not in a state of panic. They are working through this. There's a bill coming to the floor tomorrow. It was passed by the Senate this weekend. It's going to provide an additional $500 million to help low-income customers. Now, these are temporary programs because of the pandemic. We expect to see legislation introduced in the House and the Senate this year to create a permanent low-income assistance program for customers that are suffering economically. I don't know whether it's going to be, I suspect bills will have it run out of EPA instead of HHS. That's a turf battle I don't need to get into. But, we want to make sure that it's crafted thoughtfully. So those are some of the challenges I'll get into. That there are plenty more. I didn't do a PowerPoint presentation, but if you'd be interested, I can provide a written outline in my remarks that have some additional background information. I can send that to Michael, and he can distribute that to anyone who's interested.